Mic check 1 2. Mic check, mic check, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Ikaga desu ka? Mic check, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Mic check, mic check. Oh, first mic check. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Manzoku desu ka?
We're going to call the hearing to order here and ask all the members to take their seat. This is the geopolitical potential of the U.S. energy boom. Simply put, increasing U.S. energy production would boost our national security. It would also boost our economic security. Reducing our reliance on energy imports from the cartel, from the OPEC cartel, would make the United States less vulnerable to political and security-related disruptions that we face from time to time with respect to our energy supply. Increasing our energy exports would advance our geopolitical interests, including by undermining the coercive leverage that the President of Russia and others have used energy for. Indeed, Russia's annexation of the Crimean Peninsula was made easier by its energy grip over Ukraine. Russia's state-controlled gas company, Gazprom, threatened to cut off supplies to Ukraine earlier this month. This is something that Russia has done in Eastern Europe in 2006, in 2009. They turned off the valves in Ukraine. Gazprom is now threatening to double the price Ukraine pays for natural gas. Now remember, these aren't market forces at work there. This is a monopoly that the Russian government has created, and this is the dependency that we see in Eastern Europe. Now this could obviously, with respect to Ukraine, cripple the country's already weak economy, which we're trying to help. America's newly developing energy supplies could make a difference, sapping President Putin's strength while bolstering Ukraine and many other European countries. Over the past 3 years, just 7 of the applications to export natural gas have been approved by the Department of Energy, while 23 are still pending. This is government at a glacial pace. But while the United States recently became the world's largest producer of natural gas, Russia is still the biggest exporter of gas. And that is because while Putin is freely selling oil and gas around the world, we impose major impediments to exporting our energy. How much of this is Russia's economy? Well, 70% of their exports. It's 52%. 52% of what goes to pay for the budget in Russia of the military and the government is their natural gas and oil exports. So this is a lost opportunity. And I'm going to quote the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey. I think he's got this right when he said earlier this month, and this was before our colleagues in the Appropriations Committee, he said an energy-independent U.S., a net exporter of energy as a nation, let me do this again, an energy-independent and net exporter of energy as a nation has the potential to change the security environment around the world. He's not quite grammatical, but we agree with his premise. Notably in Europe and in the Middle East. And so, as we look at our strategies for the future, I think we've got to pay more and particular attention to energy as an instrument of national power, unquote. Recent innovations in energy exploration mean that U.S. production of natural gas is projected to rise 44% by 2040. This increased energy production has boosted manufacturing, creating thousands of American jobs. It has the potential of creating thousands more. But instead of exporting natural gas, companies are forced to flare the glut created by this bureaucracy. President Obama could move quickly to remove the obstacles placed on American energy exports. Since the President has chosen not to use his authority to permit natural gas exports, Congress can do the job for him by passing legislation to increase the number of countries that would receive accelerated approval of natural gas exports. The Domestic Prosperity and Global Freedom Act in the Energy and Commerce Committee would extend expedited approval of natural gas exports to all 159 World Trade Organization countries. The President should also stop blocking the long-delayed Keystone XL pipeline, which would create an estimated 20,000 jobs, direct jobs, and enhance our energy security in partnership with Canada, one of our closest allies, also one of our most reliable allies. This is an opportunity not to be missed, an opportunity to reduce our vulnerability to political decisions and events in unfriendly and unstable countries. Yet Secretary Kerry is conducting yet another review, further delaying Keystone. We should end our self-imposed sanctions on energy exports. America leads the world with its dynamic and innovative energy sector. Let's allow it to benefit the U.S. economy and our security interests worldwide. I will now turn to the ranking member for his statement, Mr. Elliot Engel of New York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this very timely hearing. This is a very important hearing and very timely. Events in Ukraine over the past few weeks have brought discussions about the future of American energy and specifically whether or not the United States should export natural gas into the headlines and onto the opinion pages. Washington Post had such an article this morning. Over the past decade, Russia has used its gas resources as a weapon to settle political disputes, and Ukraine has often been on the receiving end of these attacks. Just days into the current crisis, Gazprom announced that the prices it charged Ukraine would go up 37% the following month, and in 2009, Russia completely cut off Ukraine's gas flows, leaving millions of people in the cold. The significant increase in U.S. natural gas production in recent years has generated new interest in U.S. exports. To date, the Department of Energy has approved 7 applications to export U.S. liquefied natural gas to countries in Europe, Asia, and South America, and that's on top of other planned exports to countries with which we have a free trade agreement. So just to be clear, American companies have been approved to export natural gas. When Secretary Kerry recently testified before the committee, he noted that already approved LNG projects would eventually produce 8.5 billion cubic feet of gas per day. That number is even higher now with this week's approval of the Jordan Cove plant in Oregon. But let's not forget it takes lots of time and money to construct these complex multi-billion-dollar facilities. The first LNG export facility at Sabine Pass, Louisiana, is expected to go online next year. Exports from that plant could go to a number of countries, including Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, or other Eastern European countries, provided they have the necessary import infrastructure. However, it's not clear what impact U.S. exports would have on Europe's energy relationship with Russia. U.S. gas production has already ended most gas imports into our country, expanding the supply available for other countries. Still, Russia will continue to be a major European energy supplier due to its large reserves and proximity to its customers. By contrast, U.S. natural gas must be chilled into a liquid and shipped across the Atlantic, which obviously could be very costly. A Rice University study found that higher U.S. gas prices plus higher export costs could make shipments to both Europe and Asia unprofitable. In other words, the impact of American gas on European markets may be limited. As we weigh the pros and cons of increased energy exports, we must also carefully consider the impact on working people, small businesses here at home, and environmental aspects, including those in my district in New York. A 2012 study by the U.S. Department of Energy concluded that gas prices would rise by up to a third if the U.S. exported 12 billion cubic feet per day, yet the total volume of all export applications currently pending at DOE is 36 billion cubic feet per day, 3 times as much. If that volume of gas were exported, then domestic gas prices could go much higher, and that would almost surely have a very negative impact on all of our constituents. On a related issue, I'd be interested to hear from the panel on what would happen to domestic gasoline prices if the 40-year-old ban on crude oil exports were lifted. As we examine the future of American energy, we also need to consider the environmental impacts of extracting shale gas and oil. This process requires the injection of chemicals and other substances to unlock gas or oil deposits. I believe that companies should be required to disclose what they pump into the ground, just as they must tell us what they put in our food. Using more natural gas in the United States to produce electricity could displace dirtier coal, thus lowering greenhouse gas emissions and the negative impact on our climate. We could also bolster U.S. national security by using natural gas as a transportation fuel, which helps reduce our reliance on oil. In fact, Representative Ross Layton and I introduced bipartisan legislation last year, the Open Fuel Standard Act, that requires half of all new vehicles to run on non-petroleum fuels, such as natural gas or electricity. This bill would give consumers greater flexibility to choose more affordable fuel sources. So I'm very interested in the prospect of us exporting energy, but I think we have to weigh the pros and cons and come up with a solution. It opens up great possibilities for us, and that's why I am very interested in hearing the panel, what the panel has to say. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing, and I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We're going to go 2 minutes to Mr. Steve Shabbat of Ohio, and then 2 minutes to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank Chairman Royce for calling this timely hearing today, and I want to thank the panel of distinguished witnesses for taking the time to join with us. We're all looking forward to hearing your testimony this morning. The potential benefits afforded us by the recent U.S. energy boom are really astounding. We're presented with an opportunity to significantly strengthen our national security, to improve our economy here at home, and increase the global reliance on U.S. resources into the foreseeable future. And this is particularly timely when we find ourselves in a situation where we see the Russians, particularly Putin, acting up as he is now. While energy independence may not be realistic, energy interdependence is, and it should absolutely be pursued. The bottom line is the U.S. must seriously consider the geopolitical merits of exporting greater quantities of U.S. natural gas and oil, and we should be considering our policies very seriously that are preventing us from doing more of that right now. If we did so, it might well undermine Russia's influence over some of our European allies that are so dependent on Russia for both their fuel, whether it be gas or whether it be oil. And as I said before, when you consider what is happening with respect to Crimea, Ukraine, potentially many other countries in the region, we absolutely have to consider this. I want to thank the Chairman again for calling this very timely hearing this morning. Yield back.
Mr. Sherman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for having these hearings. Our subcommittee on terrorism and trade has had several hearings on this already, and we're having additional hearings tomorrow. The hearings tomorrow will focus just on oil as opposed to gas, because oil and gas are extremely different on this issue. Petroleum is by far the cheapest fuel to transport across water. Natural gas is by far the most expensive fuel to transport across water. The United States is not in our lifetimes going to be a net exporter of oil or even a net exporter of energy. But we can be a net exporter of natural gas, and we can consider the export of oil from Alaska and import oil onto our East Coast. This will have very little effect on anything, except it will reduce transportation costs, and it will raise the question of whether we can stop the process and keep the Alaskan oil in a time of world emergency or disruption of the markets, whether we'll have both the legal and physical infrastructure to make that change. The question then is whether we export natural gas. Keep in mind that in Germany they're paying triple, In Japan, they're paying quadruple for natural gas what we are in the United States. If we export our natural gas, prices will go up. That will be here in the United States for natural gas, very substantially. That will be good for the natural gas industry and create jobs in the natural gas production and transportation industry. But it means higher prices for consumers. It means higher prices for manufacturers. It may take away a huge advantage for manufacturers that cost us far more jobs than we will pick up in the energy sector. From the environmental standpoint, most environmentalists will oppose anything that produces or moves any carbon fuel. On the other hand, to the extent that the world burns more natural gas, that may be a boon for the environment compared to the chief alternative, which is coal, which produces twice as much carbon and greenhouse gases, and even far more than that in the terms of soot and pollution as compared with burning natural gas. And you can argue that even fracking is not as bad for our environment as is the burning of coal. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Let's see. We're going to have a diverse group of energy specialists this morning. Let me start with Admiral Dennis Blair. During his 34-year Navy career, he served in the Atlantic and Pacific fleets and commanded the Kitty Hawk Battle Group. He was Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Command. He was also the Director of National Intelligence from 2009 to 2010. He is currently a member of the Energy Security Leadership Council and Commissioner on Geopolitics at Securing America's Future Energy. Mr. Harold Hamm is the Chairman of the Domestic Energy Producers Alliance. Mr. Hamm is also Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Board of Continental Resources, Incorporated. He previously served as President, Chief Executive Officer, and as a Director of Continental Gas from 1967 until 2004. From 2008 through 2013, Ms. Elizabeth Rosenberg served as a Senior Advisor at the U.S. Department of Energy. She is currently a Senior Fellow and Director of the Energy, Environment, and Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Michael Levy was a non-resident Science Fellow and a Science and Technology Fellow in Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institute. Now, without objection, the witness's full prepared statements will be made part of the record. The members here of the committee are going to have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or any questions they might have of the witnesses and any extraneous material for the record. And we'll ask Admiral Blair if you'll go first, but if you would please summarize your remarks, and then we'll go to questions. Admiral Blair. Let's make certain you've pushed the button. There you go.
There we go. And I think I agree this is a very timely and important hearing. Energy has been a huge factor in national security matters during my experience in it. We are now in an era in which we have new possibilities due to increased domestic production, and I urge the committee to think hard, think long about how we can take advantage of this to bring advantages to our national security. I'm co-chairman of a commission on energy and geopolitics. It's a bipartisan group of high-ranking former U.S. military, diplomatic, and national security officials. It's a project of the nonpartisan, nonprofit organization Securing America's Future Energy. And we just published a report called Oil Security 2025, U.S. National Security Policy in an Era of Domestic Oil Abundance. And we make a series of recommendations to take advantage of the booming U.S. oil production to enhance American national security. Our increased production has already supported our national security objectives. The additional 3.5 million barrels per day that we now produce in this country compared to what we produced in 2005 has compensated for the virtually curtailed oil production in Libya and the slower increase in Iraq's exports than was expected. We've been able to maintain sanctions against Iran, including sanctions against its oil exports. Back in 2005, we were not able to pursue this policy because the market was too tight. So increased American oil production has already been very positive, but our study concluded that it will not be the cure-all that some pundits have prescribed or prophesized. As long as we fuel 93% of our transportation sector with petroleum, the security and resilience of the global oil market will be a vital American national security concern. If supplies are interrupted, prices go up, and no matter how much we produce at home or import from North America, our economy will suffer and may suffer badly. The Middle East will continue to be a region of vital interest with an overall tight global oil market driven by increasing world demand. The Middle East will remain the swing producer. It will be the only region able to increase production quickly and economically to compensate in the medium term for supply disruptions, whether natural or man-made. And at the same time, OPEC will manipulate the production for its own purposes, to keep prices high, to support its own foreign policy objectives. And so the United States will continue to be vitally concerned about this region, but we must do so in a smart way. Our study makes recommendations in 4 areas. First, we recommend a series of global policy recommendations to make the world oil market more secure, more resilient to supply interruptions. As one of the largest consumers and producers of oil, the United States can encourage better coordinated international action to toughen oil production and transport systems, to take swift and effective action to deal with shortages. For long-term improvement, we should share mechanical fracturing technology to increase total oil supplies. We should help build more resilient and stable political conditions in producing countries. In the Middle East, we recommend ensuring the security of oil-producing friendly countries, but with a diplomacy-centered approach. The military support component should be reconfigured, and a flexible deployed posture with a demonstrated capability to bring major forces forward when needed is what is required. The Middle East will continue to be a volatile and violent place, primarily because of domestic tensions within the countries there. And over the long term, we need to support peaceful evolutionary reform to develop more stable and eventually more democratic societies and governments there. China will account for almost half of the increased energy demand of the next 20 years, and the United States needs to involve China in plans to deal with supply interruptions and price spikes. We should help China with tight oil development and include it in the international maritime security operations needed to protect oil shipping. Of course, all these actions depend on the Chinese exercising restraint in the aggressive actions that it is taking now around its maritime borders. And finally, and most important, the United States must diversify the energy resources for its own transportation sector. We need to shift a significant portion of our car, truck, and airplane fuels away from petroleum, primarily to natural gas and electricity. This means government-supported research and development and other government policies that, while not picking commercial winners and losers, remove the barriers to this shift away from oil for transportation. So developing a strong, forward-looking energy policy is one of the most important things we can do for this country's national security, and I urge this committee to take a strong role in forging one. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral Blair. Mr. Ham.
Good morning, Chairman Royce. Thank you, Member Engel. I believe the last time I saw
Mr. Ham, it may be that we need to push that button. Thank you.
I did. Sorry about that. Good morning, Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel. I think last time I saw the Ranking Member Engel was on location with a hard hat on in North Dakota. Came up to see her Bakken oil field up there and appreciate that. In addition to the DEPA that I represent, I also co-chair the Council for Secure America. So we had several of our friends from Israel that toured the field up there. Appreciate that. Continental Resources primarily an oil producer, but we've certainly produced our share of gas as well. You know, I saw the American energy independence on the horizon some 3 years ago. It's in a position to see that, and actually DEPA put a stake in the ground at that time in October 2011, and that we were going to achieve American energy independence in this country by 2020. Had a lot of skeptics at that time, but today we don't see near as many. This technology that's come about is tremendous. You know, we hear a lot about fracking, and all that. But really, what's gone on is the space-age technology that's brought the horizontal wellbore in existence, and the ability to go down 3 miles, drill over 3 miles further, and contact so much more rock at this tight rock that we couldn't produce earlier. So it's a tremendous thing that's happened. It's unlocked a great deal of resource, and it's brought about this reality that we have today. Today, I see what's necessary to continue this American oil and gas renaissance and achieve energy security for our country and also the world. This includes utilizing American crude oil as a diplomatic tool to reduce the unfair advantage and leverage of rogue nations. And although LNG exports can't happen quickly, and someone mentioned it couldn't be done overnight, virtually we could help with oil exports that could have an immediate impact to the world. You know, during OPEC, that was mentioned here, reactionary federal laws were passed in the 1970s. Natural Gas Boiler Act was one of those. Took a long time to get rid of that and brought on a lot of the problems that we have today. Global energy industry has changed during all this time. Elected officials have repealed or let expire nearly all of those post-embargo regulations, except those banning exports, those crude oil exports, and we've had almost a virtual ban of LNG. We're seeing a few permits come through. Now it's up to 7, but there's been like 25 that's been out there waiting in the wings. But I think the debate really, whether we're going to see lower prices to consumers or not, the real debate is about the principles of free trade in the world. And if America's going to be an energy leader, we're certainly going to have to act like one and be able to export what's produced here. Will prices of natural gas go up if we're exporting? That is a good question. But I think the real answer to that is that we're going to see a lot of stability in prices as we go forward. We're not going to see the ups and downs swings that we've had with natural gas in the past. $2.50 is not good for anybody. It's not good for supply. And $8 or $10 is not good for the consumer. So we'll see a much broader market as we go forward. Someone mentioned jobs. There are about 10 million jobs in this industry today. And if we're allowed to go forward with exports, sure, we're going to add about another 1 million jobs. But we're also going to add about 1 million or more barrels of production per day in this country, for sure, in addition to what we would as we go forward. You talk about jobs. Somebody said, well, the refineries, if we only refine here the product and ship it out, that a lot of jobs are there. But with the refineries, it takes about as much to run a refinery if you're running 75% capacity or 100% capacity. The jobs are created downstream. That's where the jobs are. So I'll summarize and stop there. You have my testimony, and I'll be ready to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. Ms. Rosenberg.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the geopolitical potential of the U.S. energy boom. In my remarks, I'll discuss several themes that are explored in much greater detail in my written testimony, which I have submitted for the record. Remarkable recent increases in U.S. energy production have substantial economic and geopolitical benefits. Aside from strengthening our economy, which is instrumental to our nation's security, the domestic energy boom means that a larger portion of global oil and natural gas supply comes from reliable sources. The broad innovation and economic gains associated with the energy boom reduce U.S. indebtedness, including to countries sometimes hostile to U.S. interests, and allowed the United States new capacity and flexibility to advance foreign policy interests. To fully realize the geopolitical potential of the U.S. energy boom, however, national leaders must revise paradigms and policies that restrict energy exports. We would not be wise to hoard energy at home and disengage from strategic relationships with major global energy producers. That approach will not make us safer. We would have more scope to promote stable global markets, U.S. prosperity and our foreign policy interests with greater energy production and a more nimble and permissive export regime for liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and crude oil. For this reason, national leaders should accelerate the permitting of LNG export facilities and allow the export of crude. U.S. crude exports are subject to near total restriction currently. Lifting these restrictions would ease supply bottlenecks and market dislocations and signal drillers to continue production growth. This would generate more revenue and expand the share of global crude from a stable producer. Crude exports would raise some oil prices in some parts of the United States to come in line with global benchmark pricing. However, it's unlikely that this would increase retail gasoline prices for consumers, and they might even drop marginally. If the United States maintains current crude export restrictions, it will prevent U.S. oil production expansion. This means foregoing an opportunity to shrink OPEC's market share and its cartel pricing power. Foregoing crude exports would also mean reduced U.S. policy leverage over Iran. If international nuclear talks with Iran fail, U.S. policy leaders may want to implement tough new sanctions to remove all Iran's oil exports from the market. Congressional proposals to this effect are credible if sufficient affordable alternative oil supplies are available so that the international community will participate in sanctions. The United States should help ensure that these alternatives are available by encouraging its crude production and exports instead of relying on OPEC to do so. Future planned U.S. LNG exports represent an economic and strategic benefit for the United States. They would bring greater supplier diversity, more competitive pricing arrangements, and less politicized contract terms for allies and partners abroad. The United States is a stable producer and would ship LNG along trade routes that involve few maritime choke points and hotspots. U.S. LNG would represent an important economic plank of the U.S. rebalance to Asia and would meaningfully contribute to the energy security of America's alliance partners in Northeast Asia. Additionally, LNG exports will directly and indirectly help to diversify European gas markets away from their 30% reliance on Russia. This, other technical assistance, and diplomatic engagement to help Europe access its indigenous shale gas and reform regional markets will have meaningful impact in eroding Russian pricing power and coercion in Europe. Refraining from selling LNG or crude abroad in order to support domestic manufacturing or refining industries or to halt energy production growth would undermine U.S. foreign relations and the scope of our leadership abroad. It would also cause the United States to lose out economically to other countries that promote greater production and export. As the United States thinks about the energy and foreign policy agenda that can best promote prosperity and our national interest, it must prioritize responsible production of energy and its unencumbered export. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Levy.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to speak with you here today. I'm a senior fellow for energy and the environment at the Council on Foreign Relations and director of CFR's program on energy security and climate change. Rising U.S. oil and gas production is delivering important economic, security, and climate benefits, even as it poses real environmental challenges. I want to begin by discussing these in the context of energy exports in Russia before touching on some broader issues. The United States should allow both oil and gas exports. The basic geopolitical calculation is not fundamentally about Russia. The United States has long promoted open markets as the best guarantor of energy security. In the last 2 years, it has effectively challenged Chinese restrictions on raw materials exports at the World Trade Organization. If the United States were to block exports or restrict them only to friends or NATO allies, that would undermine its ability to challenge other countries' restrictions and to uphold a global open trading system. Turning our back on our longstanding strategy would be unwise. Exports are, however, not without costs. While both oil and gas exports would, on balance, be mildly beneficial to the U.S. economy, and while oil exports would probably nudge gasoline prices down, natural gas exports would raise the domestic natural gas prices slightly, increasing home heating and electricity bills. At a minimum, Congress should mitigate harm to the most vulnerable by ensuring that the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program is properly funded. Energy exports would also promote greater domestic energy development, and along with it, local environmental risks. That makes it all the more important for state authorities to develop strict environmental rules and for the federal government to impose minimum national standards, including for disclosure where practical. I haven't said anything yet about Russia. Let me focus first on natural gas. U.S. natural gas exports would indeed hurt Russia. U.S. exports would prompt Russia to lower its natural gas prices, reducing Russian revenues and harming the state. The ultimate impact, though, would be limited by the fact that relatively high-cost delivered U.S. gas exports can't push prices down too far, and because Russian revenues are dominated by oil, not gas sales. U.S. natural gas exports would do far less to reduce European dependence on Russian natural gas. U.S. exports will flow mainly to Asia because that is the most profitable destination. Russia can largely maintain its market share in Europe by underpricing U.S. exports. In addition, in a future crisis, Europe's ability to shift from Russian to U.S. supplies will be limited by scarce terminal and pipeline capacity. Expediting or eliminating the Department of Energy review process wouldn't fundamentally change any of this analysis. Commercially attractive projects have mostly been able to get DOE approval. It is the commercial fundamentals and the time to build facilities that is the main restraint on U.S. exports. I haven't mentioned oil exports in the Russian context yet. That's because oil exports are a fairly weak tool against Russia. Europe can already buy oil from elsewhere if Russian supplies are cut off. It doesn't need U.S. exports to do that. Allowing oil exports might also eventually reduce world oil prices by a few dollars, marginally hurting Russia, but not dealing it a large blow. I'd like to close with two broader observations about the geopolitical potential of the energy boom. The first is that the greatest security dividends will come from increased production, not from increased exports per se. How different would our conversations about how to confront Russia today be if we were a natural gas importer, which is what essentially every expert predicted 10 years ago? On the oil front, the greatest geopolitical dividend is a reduced risk of higher oil prices and all the security complications that entails. It's impossible to pin down the precise impact of the U.S. boom on oil prices, but the odds of higher prices have been reduced. The second broad observation is that we create real risks by overstating the benefits of the boom. The oil boom will not make us energy independent in any meaningful way, and it's essential that we continue to pursue efforts to cut our own oil consumption in order to reduce our vulnerability to disruptions in the world. It's also essential that we carefully weigh the environmental risks of oil and gas production in deciding what areas to open to development. In fact, I would submit that putting our industry on as firm and sustainable a regulatory foundation as possible is essential to fully exploiting the long-term geopolitical opportunities presented by the boom. Members of the committee, thank you again for inviting me to be here today. I look forward to answering any questions you have.
Thank you, Dr. Levy. My focus has been fundamentally on a particular set of circumstances in Eastern Europe in which Russia does have a monopoly. Monopoly with some countries, near monopoly with others. Poland, 2/3 of their gas is from Russia today. What gets our attention, I think, on the committee was, I don't know how many of the members here saw the story, but a few years ago, or it was actually last year, as Russia was involved in its machinations in Ukraine, they were able to turn off the valve or threaten to turn off the valve. And what the Poles did and what the Hungarians did was to sell 2 billion cubic yards of gas, run it through their pipelines back into Ukraine in order to keep Ukraine on life support. And watching what Russia has done repeatedly in terms of turning off the valves, going to this larger explanation that Ms. Rosenberg and others explain in terms of the competitive effect or what happens when you do have a monopoly. And that's what Russia's been able to do with Gazprom by having a state-run company there and basically nationalizing this and controlling it. They've been able to do the same thing that OPEC does in tandem with Russia in terms of trying to set the oil price. They've been able to set the price. And they've been able to do one thing further, which is actually turn off the valves in winter when somebody doesn't do their bidding, which has created enormous consternation inside Ukraine, for example. We would not be here today. We would not have had a government fall in Kiev had it not been for the ability of Russia to, help create a crisis there. So geopolitically, as we're looking at Eastern Europe, my interest has been, what could we do in order to try to engineer a circumstance where enough gas gets approval. It'll take a while, obviously, for the facilities to be built, although there are facilities in Spain, for example, that would feed into the pipeline. But, the futures market operates instantaneously. The market responds quickly. The ruble, the currencies fall quickly when they hear about a national plan. And your ability to control a monopoly is dissolved when there is an alternative. And so this is the question for me, is how much of an advantage is it for us in terms of our strategic interests and those of our allies. I note, by the way, that the Speaker of the House has a letter from the head of state of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, all asking for just such an initiative for the same reason that Ukraine has this dependency. They have this dependency. And so their request is, can you develop a strategy where you can export into that market? That's what I'm interested in today, and I would just ask Ms. Rosenberg or Mr. Levy or anyone else. I know there's a little bit of difference of opinion on this, but Ms. Rosenberg, what would be your take on that?
So to the point of the role of U.S. LNG helping to diversify European gas assets, gas supplies, and its ability to help Europe get out from under some of the influence of Russia, LNG has a role to play, but as has been noted already, the impact won't be immediate, and it won't be the silver bullet here. So it's true that sending a strong signal from the United States.
Well, let me ask you this. Lithuania's sole supply of natural gas comes from Russia. Clearly, this is one of the reasons you see the Lithuanians toying with the idea of an LNG facility. Now, pricing may not depend upon this. Maybe the monopoly doesn't drive price, but in Lithuania's case, it pays the highest price for gas in all of Europe. So it sounds like there's perhaps a more direct connection to that monopoly than we'd like to assume. The Lithuanians certainly believe it. And so that's why I raise these points.
Right. I would note that Lithuania will be in the position to benefit from additional LNG supplies available to its market, which will help diversify its gas supply, that being the goal for reducing the pricing influence of Russia.
Mr. Levy?
The answer to your question is going to depend on the particular country, and we need to look at how each is integrated or not integrated into the European energy space. Let me just focus on a few pieces of this. Ukraine is different from these other countries. In the case of Ukraine, Russia is not threatening to raise prices from typical levels to much higher ones. They're threatening to raise prices from severely depressed levels, subsidized levels, to the kind of price that a country like the United States might offer. So we're hard-pressed to combat that. If we want to help make Ukraine more resilient there, we need to provide assistance that helps them transition from their heavy industry, which is completely unprofitable unless they get subsidized Russian gas, to a more sustainable foundation. Our aid packages are typically focused on getting through the current crisis.
All right, but I take your point, although they're talking about doubling the price of gas, but I take your point. The reality, though, is if you're in manufacturing, I used to be in business, and you're going to have interrupted supply, and you find out that in the winters your supplier, Russia, is going to turn off the valve, that doesn't leave for a lot of rationale for investment for overseas in rebooting your economy. Mr. Ham.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, it's not about Russian revenues, it's about heat, and that was your point. And when you have the ability to turn off that heat, you know, we can relate that pretty well with the winter we've had here this past winter. So you have to have alternatives. And if the alternatives are there, immediately you have an impact. And so providing the alternatives through LNG, transport, and other things, you know, it could be that you'd have storage there and a few things like that that could alleviate those situations where they couldn't turn the heat off.
Thank you, Mr. Ham. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too have the concerns that the chairman has. I am intrigued by the possibility of exporting gas and oil to counter Russia, to give Putin less of a monopoly or less of a start. And I think that by and large we would have to be crazy not to consider it. I think it needs to be looked at and considered, and I'm all for that from a geopolitical point of view. I'm not saying we should rush to it, but we should do it, and we should do it, I think, look at this as soon as possible. But the bottom line, when I look at my constituents and I look at the rest of us look at our constituents, people back home want to know the bottom line. Will prices of natural gas go up? What will the impact be on gasoline prices? The average person is more concerned about their own pocketbook, and that's a concern of mine. The whole fracking issue. Mr. Ham, I'm very glad I went to North Dakota, saw you there, and was frankly impressed by and large. I still have questions, but impressed with what I see. The average person in my district hears about fracking and they go crazy because they think it's going to ultimately contaminate their drinking water. They hear all kinds of horror stories. So I think those of us, we have to weigh the overriding concerns, geopolitical concerns, which are very important, but we also have to care, obviously, about what our constituents feel about the danger, potential danger of fracking, or whether the prices of natural gas will go up, prices of gasoline will go up. So I'm going to let me start with you, Mr. Ham, the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I've said.
Thank you, Chairman. Engel, you know, you saw firsthand, you know, the safety that goes into the fracking process up there, and that's good. You know, it's there's a lot of concern out there and a lot of situations. You know, I think you know, before you debate all the benefits of price and all that, is take into consideration what's really happened already with the tight oil that's been brought on, particularly the Bakken. We've seen average prices reduced by about 20% on diesel because of the content of that quality premium crude up there. Also brought down the price of gasoline. We've seen it lower this year than before. So it's very helpful as we see the broadened market, and it'll also help this broadened market of gas. Natural gas is helping. I mean, I used to talk about natural gas in terms of 55 BCF a day. Now we're approaching 75. Yet we're able to take care of that market and do it very well because of the increased supply we have, approaching 200 years supply that many of us think is there. So overall, I think the price is going to be much more stable, and we can take care of these LNG exports.
Because there is, and I mentioned it, a 2012 Energy Department study that said natural gas prices could rise by up to a third under a high export scenario of 12 billion cubic feet per day, and the total volume of all export applications before DOE is 36 billion cubic feet per day, or 3 times higher than DOE's high scenario. So I worry about the effect of domestic prices if all the gas in the contracts are exported. Dr. Levy, let me ask you, you testified that the impact of U.S. energy exports on U.S. relationships around the world is being overstated. You mentioned that the infrastructure constraints in Europe, for example, and higher LNG prices would make it unlikely that U.S. gas would displace Russian gas. Could you talk more about these market dynamics?
Absolutely. The reality is that in the European market, Russian gas is less expensive than delivered U.S. gas. Certainly, the domestic gas price here is much lower, but once you liquefy it, transport, and regasify it, you end up with a fairly high price. Now, there are some consumers who will pay for diversity and will pay to spread their bets a bit, and that's why I would not say that U.S. gas will displace no Russian gas. But for the most part, these companies want to be competitive on a day-to-day basis in the global economy and are going to go to the lowest price. And the other thing to keep in mind is crisis dynamics. We all saw over the last several months during this record cold snap in the United States how infrastructure constraints in this country made it difficult to bring our abundant natural gas to parts of the country where it was in extraordinarily high demand, driving natural gas and electricity prices up. Infrastructure constraints are real, and companies don't overbuild massively just to respond to unusual events. It's no different in Europe, and that would undermine Europe's ability to absorb very large amounts of gas from a different source during a crisis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, could I just add one point of discussion? I get a little impatient about discussions of the day-to-day price when you realize that by having a low day-to-day price with a very vulnerable, rickety program, you are subject to crises which we will then have to spend billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars on to fix with military force or higher or other forms of national power. I've seen it in the Middle East, where price of oil was not what we were paying it with at the pump. It was the price of what we were paying plus the lives, the treasure of the country that we were sending over to that part of the world in order to keep stability and restore order there. So the idea that we just have to keep the lowest possible price on a day-to-day basis and not think about some consequences that could happen if we don't take prudent action to be more resilient and more independent, as I think really short-sighted. And we have to balance these long-term needs, which we have paid in the past, which we will pay in the future, unless we take prudent action now in terms of diversity and resilience.
Well, Admiral, I agree with you, but we have to balance it, because the average consumer out there, the average constituent that all of us has, cares a lot about what happens in Ukraine, as I do. But the bottom line for them is how much are they paying out of their pocketbook. And that is certainly a factor that those of us that make policy have to consider, because the people back home are concerned about fracking, are concerned about the price of natural gas, are concerned about the price of gasoline. So while I believe that we need to look at our policy, because I don't like what Putin's done, I want to have a counterbalance to Putin, our constituents, the first thing that's important for them is the bottom line in terms of what they pay. And every one of us that needs to be responsive to our constituents really have to take that into a strong account.
With respect, Mr. Anger, I think we're undervaluing the American people a little bit here. I think they understand that to make life better for their children, not to have to send military forces out to handle situations which could have been handled had we taken prudent action domestic earlier, is a smart investment. And with good leadership, I think they will understand that, and that they will support wise policy in that area.
Well, I hope so, but please understand that everything is a balance, and those of us who run for office have to weigh that balance.
Congressman, if I can briefly add, the main investments in resilience in the current context need to be made by our friends and allies in Europe to build extra capacity so that they can be resilient in the face of a crisis. Their underinvestment leads to our having to come in and bail them out.
We're going to go to Mr. Duncan of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I noted through my amendment that was accepted in the Ukraine legislation we marked up in this committee yesterday, I strongly support the U.S. promotion of natural gas exports and advances in energy extraction and exploration technologies. I further believe that it's urgent that the administration strive to expedite approval of LNG export terminals. The approval of the Jordan Cove project in Oregon on Monday is a good sign, but we've got more work to do. I think blanket approval would have an equally important psychological impact on the geopolitical environment, especially surrounding the Ukraine. I point the committee to a Thursday, March 20th, Wall Street Journal opinion called A Gas Export Strategy, and I'll provide a copy for the record, Mr. Chairman. But the Russian economy, Mr. Putin's political cronies, are highly dependent on petrodollars. And I think it's important that we send the right signal, not only to Russia, but really to a lot of folks around the globe. I also want to point in that article, it mentions that European nations are currently dependent on Russia for 70% to 100% of their natural gas. And the Deputy Chief of Mission for the Czech Republic told a House hearing this year that his country has found that even the decline in U.S. gas imports in recent years has freed up more gas for Europe, lowered prices, and thus weakened the Russian negotiating position during contract renewal talks. I think that's imperative that we think about. If it's weakened their negotiating position, it's weakened their income and their income stream to Putin's presidency. And so I can't really talk about energy and geopolitical arena without talking about the benefits of the U.S. energy boom with respect to why we need Keystone Pipeline. Now, Keystone XL, I recently met with some members of the Canadian Parliament, and it's crystal clear to me that the President's polarization and unexplainable delay on the transport of Canadian crude oil to the U.S. refineries through Keystone has hurt the geopolitical relationship with one of our most important and biggest trading partner, and that's in Canada. I also want to mention, for the sake of the discussion here today, that former Joint Chief Chairman Martin Dempsey said in a House hearing just last week, an energy-independent U.S. and a net exporter of energy as a nation has the potential to change the security environment around the world, notably in Europe and in the Middle East. And so as we look at our strategies for the future, I think we've got to pay more attention, and particular attention, to energy as an instrument of national power. I think that sums up my position. If we want to change the geopolitical environment, the United States being energy independent and lessen our dependence on anything coming from the Middle East changes the geopolitical environment with regard to support for terrorism and other things that may come out from the Middle East. And so I think that is a tremendous summary of where we are. So I'd like to shift gears, Admiral Blair, and focus in this hemisphere to the south, and that's with Venezuela, because I think it's imperative that as we talk about energy and political dynamics, that we think about that tremendous exporter and exporter to the U.S. that Venezuela is. So they have the largest proven reserves of oil in the world, estimated in 2013 at 297 billion barrels. In 2011, Venezuela was the fourth largest foreign supplier of crude oil and products to the U.S. With the protests and violence have resulted in the deaths of more than a dozen Venezuelans at the hand of President Maduro's regime, should the U.S. use its economic leverage and halt our imports or limit our imports of Venezuelan oil, and as that revenue doesn't impact the people in Venezuela as much as it would impact the regime that's down there with President Maduro. So if you could speak to two things. If you could speak to Chairman Dempsey's remarks that I mentioned earlier about American energy independence being an exporter and its impact on geopolitical dynamics. And then if you could speak to Venezuela, I certainly would appreciate it. So, Admiral?
Yes, sir. I certainly share General Dempsey's contention that if the United States uses its newfound oil abundance smart, it would be a real game changer. I guess my feelings have solidified by watching the Middle East. We did not send troops into the Middle East to take possession of oil fields and to take over the oil, but we sent them there in large numbers because of the oil-based importance of that region to the world economy and therefore to the U.S. economy. And the stability and security of that region was important to us from a national security point of view. Had we not been so dependent on the Middle East in that sense, we would have treated the troubles there the way we treated them in other parts of the world that are going through turmoil, where there's suffering going on, where there may be combination of interests and opportunities. But this huge investment of military force there at the bottom was caused by the oil importance of that region. So I agree completely that energy security for this country, more flexibility in terms of our energy picture would make a huge difference, a decisive difference in the position of the United States in the world. So I think that's completely true. On Venezuela, unfortunately, as you know better than I, the oil market is pretty well an international global market, and exactly where it comes from and exactly where it goes to is really does not make that much difference. We are not very dependent on Middle East oil, for example, but we are dependent on oil, and that's what makes the difference. So I don't really think that, I haven't found that blocking particular exports from particular countries really makes the big difference in the whole thing. As you know, Venezuela is doing a pretty good job of running its oil industry into the ground on its own without any help from anybody else, and the dissatisfaction within Venezuela that's caused by that in terms of the standard of living, the corruption, and so on, is doing a pretty good job of discrediting the Maduro's administration as it had the Chavez administration before he died, and they're going to have a hard time holding on to power. So I think that we've got a lot of important internal forces in Venezuela that are working for us, and if we could do a few things to help those along, I think that would be just fine. But I think the Venezuelan people are going to take care of this corrupt and autocratic and misguided government that they've had to endure for a while themselves.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I will remind the committee there is no national security without energy security. With that, I yield back.
We go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
Thank you. I misspoke a little earlier. Our subcommittee hearings on the export of oil are next week, not tomorrow. I don't think we should be fantasizing about the United States being a net exporter of oil. That's just not going to happen. Yes, it would dramatically change the world. So would the invention of cold fusion, but that's not around the corner either. And the wars that we have fought in the Middle East have been about oil, used chiefly for vehicles, not natural gas, which competes with coal, which, while dirty, is at least abundant. And I don't think a country has fought a war just to meet its carbon targets, much as every country would like to brag to the world that it's creating less greenhouse gases. What is and I don't know who to address this question to, does Dr. Levy, you'll answer it unless somebody else knows more. What does it cost per MCF to liquefy natural gas, move it 1,000 miles over water, and regasify it? And does that price go up much if you're moving it 10,000 miles instead of 1,000 miles? Is there a major cost to the ocean transport, or is the key cost liquefaction and regasification? Ms. Rosenberg.
Sure. Perhaps $6 to $8 for the liquefaction, the transportation, the regasification. Of course, as you mentioned, the price depends somewhat on how far you're transporting it, and Europe being closer.
So you could make quite a profit if it wasn't for the federal government and buying gas for $3.35 an MCF, spending $6 to $8 to transport it, and selling it in Japan where it sells for $16.
That's the reason why many.
That's why we're here.
Yes, and why there's an expectation that, in fact, much U.S. LNG will be exported primarily to that market in East Asia, Northeast Asia.
And then so we have a circumstance where American manufacturers are paying less than a quarter of what Japanese manufacturers are paying, And if we allowed this export, we would still have an advantage because American manufacturers wouldn't have to pay for the liquefaction, et cetera. But instead of having a 4 times advantage, we'd have, say, a 2 times advantage. Has anybody done a study as to how many manufacturing jobs we would lose if we lost that tremendous advantage to our manufacturers on the price of natural gas? Dr. Levy?
It's difficult to pin down. I did some basic calculations a year or 2 ago that suggest that the impact on U.S. manufacturing would be roughly neutral and on overall jobs would be beneficial. The reason it's neutral for overall manufacturing is because exports affect manufacturing in 2 ways. First, they raise the price of natural gas, but they also spur a lot of demand for manufactured products, particularly steel and cement that are heavily used in the natural gas industry. About 30% of the cost of a well is manufactured.
The energy industry would lose jobs, but the energy industry would pick up jobs, and some of those jobs would be classified as manufacturing jobs because the energy industry isn't just the people who lay the pipeline, it's the people who make the steel for the pipeline. Now I'd point out that one way to possibly deal with this would be to impose some tax on our exports of natural gas. I would point out that the U.S. Constitution has a provision designed to prevent that. And I don't know if I'm going to ask others, unless the panel has any loopholes in that? Any proposals to tax the export of natural gas that would get through the constitutional provision? I can ask constitutional experts, Dr. Levy, unless you have an answer.
I share your policy inclination, but the provision is being upheld in the face of a variety of attempted loopholes over the last decades.
My old bros in the tax law industry have always found a loophole to prevent a tax, and I'm sure that that same energy can be used to impose one. In 2012, the Department of Energy found that domestic natural gas prices would rise by about 1/3. Do you tend to agree with that outcome? And what does that do for my dream of having a natural gas-powered vehicle fleet in the United States instead of petroleum, which would be a game changer in geopolitics? Mr. Ham.
Yes. Well, I think that number is way high. You look at what happened this winter. We had a tremendous draw. Increased demand was way high, but we didn't see natural gas prices go up 1/3. We saw it increase moderately, so I don't believe those numbers. Nobody in the industry believes those numbers. I'd like to comment too on the fantasy of exports from the.
I'm sorry, I've got limited time, and commenting on my fantasies is something that'll have to be reserved for others.
We're
I yield
exporting
back.
currently 4 million barrels a day.
Mr. Perry, Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ham, if you want to comment on the export, please go ahead. I'd like you to.
I appreciate that. A lot of people don't understand the extent of the exports that we're doing today. We're exporting. We're exporting refined products to the tune of 4 million barrels a day, current IEA numbers. So if anybody doesn't think we're exporting, read the numbers. 4 million barrels, and we're exporting the very things that's important to the consumers: diesel, gasoline, propane. That's what we're exporting today, 4 million barrels a day. So that's going on. One other example I'd like to point out, the Hawaiian example. That's being the product that they use there is being delivered by South Korea. Yet due to the ban, we can't send them oil from America. We can't send oil to supply that demand. So it's being supplied by foreign oil. So that's just another fairly good example.
Thank you. Dr. Levy, regarding disclosure and fracking, because you mentioned it a couple times in your testimony, just exactly, from your opinion, what is it that the folks that are doing hydraulic fracturing aren't disclosing?
There aren't consistent rules to require disclosure of all of the contents of fracking fluids. Now, let me be clear. I am not personally worried that injection of fracking fluids is contaminating water. My recommendations are driven by a desire to increase public confidence in the process.
I don't know that there's a lack of public confidence, in my opinion. I mean, I think there's a certain constituency, but I think your words are powerful. So, I think it's important that you realize when you say certain things, they have an effect. And even though there might not be regulatory efforts to your standard at a federal level or to your desire, something as simple as an OSHA-required MSDS, Material Safety Data Sheet, requires that everybody disclose every single thing on every job site, including everything that's put into the ground. So when people say nothing's disclosed, to me, that is a gross, you're not decrying the facts as they really are. And if you want to comment, go ahead. I'm not here to impugn you, but I want to make the record clear.
No, and I want to make the record clear as well. I did not intend to say that there is no disclosure. I think we could do better.
Well, we can always do better at everything, I imagine, but that's important. So when you talked about, I think you also talked about you would advocate for increased production. So would you be advocating for more drilling permitting on federal lands in the United States?
I think you need to look on a case-by-case basis. I think if we're looking at the shale boom right now, the opportunity is primarily on private lands. That's not mainly because of federal policy. That's because of the geology. And so I don't know that that is the place to focus our energies. I think we would do better if we wanted to focus energies on making sure that infrastructure can get built. We heard about flaring, for example,
Right.
this gas not being used. That's primarily not because of a lack of exports. It's because people don't have the right regulatory infrastructure in which to build pipelines to bring that gas to domestic markets. So those are the places I would focus first.
Okay, so based on that, I mean, I understand the geology. We got to go where the source is, but it seems to me that wherever it is, whether it's federal or private lands, our strategy ought to be whatever is economically viable and supports what's good for America. That's what we ought to be doing. And regarding the pipeline, then, are you saying you're a supporter of the Keystone XL pipeline, concluding that, or starting with construction of that and finishing it?
I think that the benefits of approving the Keystone XL pipeline would exceed the costs. There are costs, but if I were to provide advice, it would be that we approve the pipeline and start focusing on things that actually matter for American security and for climate change.
So we're using my time, but I'm fascinating that you think the benefits would exceed the cost, but the folks that are willing to invest obviously think that the benefits far outweigh the cost from every single measure. But anyhow, I'm not looking for an answer. I just find that fascinating. Admiral Blair, just because your organization and you look at it holistically at what would be good for America from a geopolitical perspective and energy, should we be drilling in Anwar?
We are not going to either drill or conserve our way out of our current dependency. What we really need to do is get off oil in the transportation sector. That's where I'd put my first emphasis.
Okay, so what about a second emphasis? Because we're not going to get off oil by the flip of a switch. So in the meantime, what are we doing?
Right. I think that we should be drilling more under safe and rigid environmental constructions, and and I believe that should be done in Alaska as in other places.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So we go to Mr. Series of New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the panel being here today. You know, this fellow Putin, I think while we sleep, he plots. And I think he's been plotting this for a long time, taking over. And I think he saw what Saudi Arabia means to oil. He figured that by assuming the gas in Russia, he could do the same thing. But I want to bring it closer to home, because we have I know we're focused on the Ukraine and what's going on, but I want to bring it closer to home. We have a situation in Venezuela. You have Maduro, who is constantly using the oil and basically bending other leaders in the Caribbean and in Central and South America, their arms, in terms of what they can say it can do. And we have a situation now where the OAS, I think, is afraid to speak because of all the members are dependent on Maduro's oil. What would be wrong for us to become an exporter of fuel to the Western Hemisphere and play a role and take away some of these influence or some of these leaders. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I can address part of that, Congressman Cyrus. As Mr. Ham said, we do export distilled products, and a lot of that does go to Latin America. The question is, as you know, the main recipient of cheap Venezuelan oil is Cuba.
Well, also Dominican Republic and some of the other islands, and and some of the other places.
Right, but I don't think we want to get into a price war for who can give away the cheapest oil to Latin American countries with Venezuela. That's a losing game in the long run. I think in the long view, increasingly the Venezuelan people, and certainly a lot of others in Latin America, recognize the Venezuelan government for what it is, and they turn to other forms of government. And I don't mind nudging that along, but I think we ought to recognize that the long-term trends are in favor of those Latin American countries who realize that stronger democracies, better rights, more open economies are going to win, and that's playing in our favor in the long run.
I also think long-term, Venezuela is starting to realize that giving away the oil is not in the best interest, and I think their attitude is changing. So if their attitude is changing, and we reckon, and there's a void there, I mean, North America is going to be flush with oil. You got Mexico, you have us, you have Canada. I don't know, I just think we could be a bigger player in some of these areas. And can you talk a bit about the winners and losers of exporting oil? Because I know that the National Economic Research Association conducted a study on the impact on the U.S. economy of exporting fuel. Can you talk a little bit about the winners and losers on that?
Congressman, can I make a point on your former question about
Sure.
Latin America? I think actually that we would do well to learn a lesson from the conversation we're having about Europe and helping Europe to get out from under Russian influence, energy influence. And so when we talk about exporting energy to Europe, we also talk about the impact of exporting energy technology. That's something we can do for Latin American countries as well, exporting energy technology and know-how, technical assistance to help establish some of the, or improve some of the legal, taxation, regulatory regimes that can help them to better access their own domestic energy resources to improve markets, pricing in that region, which can help them to also diversify their supply base and rely less on certain supplies that they receive from Venezuela.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, it gets some of these countries away from somebody's, they got them under their thumb. They can't move.
Congressman, on the exports question, producers would benefit, refiners would pay more for their oil supplies. Those are the main constituencies affected. There would be smaller consequences for the overall economy, positive consequences, but relatively small, and small consequences for consumers, slightly lower gasoline prices, but not much lower gasoline prices.
My time is, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sirius. Well, we're now going to go to Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr.
Florida.
Chairman. Appreciate it, and I appreciate all the panel being here. Admiral Blair, and this is for everybody, and this is kind of a rhetorical question, but the #1 charge for the federal government is national security, and I think we're all in agreement with that. And as Congressman Duncan said, we can't have national security if we don't have energy security, and that goes with food security and several other things. You were talking about, do you feel energy independence or security is possible, Admiral Blair, in this country, the United States of America?
I think energy security is possible, not energy independence. And security means that the system that we depend on, combination of what we make ourselves and imports, is resilient enough, and we have enough repair capacity that we can handle most of the interruptions that would occur. And I think we can build that if we can get this amount of petroleum down that we use in the transportation sector from 93%, which it is right now, down to, say, 50%, 40%.
Right.
Then we have energy security. It's not independence, and I think that's kind of a phony
Well, I think we get tied up on energy independence versus security, and I think security is the more important issue, and I agree with you 100%. And it's imperative, wouldn't you agree, that we are secure in the fact that I lived through the 1970s oil embargo. Dr. Levy, were you around then? The one where the ships weren't coming in, and I had to wait in line for hours to get 10 gallons of gas that we could buy on odd or even days, depending on the last number of our license plate. And I never want to be there again. And I think every policy we do as a federal government should be to make America stronger. Because if we don't do that, who's going to do that? Nobody else is going to look out for America. So everything we do, and I think energy sector is the #1 driver for so many things. I'm got a real strong ag background. The price of diesel goes up. The price of every product you buy goes up immediately. And to be secure, we have to have a secure, steady supply, whether it's from our allies like Canada or Mexico. And it's just imperative that we work out that security agreement. And Mr. Ham, you were saying, in your opinion, do you see it's possible that the U.S. could be a net exporter of energy?
Yes, we are today. I mean, if you get right down to it.
I was glad to
could
see
be.
you clarify
Yeah.
that, because I agree we can, and I think we should be, because I think that, again, makes America stronger. Our manufacturing sector, if our policies aren't for the betterment of America, these manufacturers with the increased prices are going to go overseas. You know, we've already fighting regulations, rules, mandates, the Affordable Care Act, that are, so many of these companies are running overseas because they can't afford to do business here. And the assault on coal in this area is just, it's just unconscionable that our government would do that. So again, every policy we do should be to make America stronger. With a net export, do you project the cost and the price in America to go up? And it sounds like across the board, it was pretty much no.
No.
Or not nearly what we're saying, hearing from the experts.
That's correct.
Dr. Levy, is it Levy or Levi? Levy. We've got a county in our district called Levy County, so excuse me.
Off to visit.
And it's a great county. It's a big agricultural county. You're saying the strict economic rules would increase the cost to the average consumer, especially the very one most vulnerable. You were talking about the LIHEAP program and how it's important that we keep that in there. It's kind of a subsidy that we keep there, but yet with our strict environmental rules, does that not increase the cost of the energy?
It does increase the cost of energy. Let me give you some figures, but then give you a broader context. The International Energy Agency did a study a couple years ago where it outlined 22 golden rules for gas to put it on sound footing, and estimated that it would cost an extra 7% in capital costs for each well to comply with those. When I talked to a senior executive from one of the top oil services company and said, is that realistic, 7%? They said, no, it's much lower. So that's important to keep in mind. It's also important to keep in mind that if there is a public backlash against development and people say you can't drill no matter how you do it, the prices will go up far more.
But I think we need that balance between national security and cost, as the Admiral brought up. I don't think we need to worry so much about the cost, because you can't put the cost against national security. So I think our policies that we move forward, we can't be strong and we can't export gas if we don't put in the infrastructures today.
Could I comment on that?
Mr. Chairman, I'm about out of time. Can you comment?
We'll let Mr. Ham comment, and then we'll go to Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Right now, we have a very strong state system for regulations. We don't need an overlying federal system. We have a 2,000-foot pipeline right now that's held up. It's federally controlled lands in North Dakota that's held up a pipeline system up there for over 10 months. We have all the rest of it built. So that's what we get up against.
I agree. Thank you for your comment.
Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say to my friend Mr. Yoho, Mr. Levy and I both read about that 73 thing in history books, and delighted to be with somebody who actually lived through it. Mr. Ham, let me just give in your last comment. I mean, basically, another way of interpreting what you just said was the states can handle fracking regulation on their own, and we don't need no stinking federal government to get in there and regulate for us. The fact of the matter is, there is wide variety of regulation in fracking that's anything but uniform. We go from some states that have fairly strict controls, California, to some other states that have Wild West controls, I don't know, like maybe Pennsylvania. Your view is that's a system that's working just fine in protecting consumers and communities and doesn't need any help from the federal government whatsoever. Is that right?
That's correct. That system has done a very fine job in Oklahoma. You know, we've got over 100 years and fracked hundreds of thousands of wells, zero pollution to fresh water. Pennsylvania has been to Oklahoma. They've gone through all of our regs there. They've got a very good system, and it's working fine there.
Okay. Good to have it on the record. Mr. Levy, you were asked about the Keystone Pipeline. Is there any evidence at all that the Keystone Pipeline will help us in terms of our domestic security? Admiral Blair doesn't like the term energy independence, and I take his point, but for the sake of shorthand, and achieving energy independence. My impression is all of that oil has been signed up for 5 long-term contracts going to the Port Arthur, Texas, for a reason. Not for consumption here, but for export. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't think that the Keystone XL pipeline would substantially increase American national security for the reasons that Admiral Blair talked about in a broader context. We live in a global oil market.
I'm asking a different question.
About export.
Is there any evidence any of it would go for domestic consumption, and if so, how?
I'm confident that at least some of it would go for domestic consumption. The intention, as I understand it, is that it would be refined in the United States, and some of the refined products would be shipped abroad, where there's a bigger market, and others of them would be sold domestically.
Have you looked at the long-term contract signed by the owners of the Keystone Pipeline?
I have not.
Every single one. There are 5 long-term contracts, which is a little unusual for a pipeline, because generally they kind of participate in the spot market. But all 5 contracts are long-term contracts, and all 5 are with companies that specialize in export. And the reason you go to Port Arthur, as opposed to termini throughout the Middle West, all the way down to Port Arthur, presumably is because you're near the ocean, where there are big ships that can carry product. I mean, why would I pipe oil or product to Port Arthur, Texas, in order to refine it so that consumers in the middle of Nebraska can benefit from it?
We have a lot of sophisticated refineries in Texas, and when you have refineries in place, multi-billion-dollar refineries that are tuned to a particular quality and type of oil, you don't take them apart and put them somewhere else.
Are you aware of the fact that the documents filed by the company that would own the Keystone Pipeline, the Canadian company, actually admit explicitly that if the pipeline were to be built, the price of oil and other related products in the Midwest would probably increase?
Yes, and I think that's a correct judgment. That's part of the goal. That's important to distinguish between oil and refined products. I do not believe they have said that the price of refined products would increase. The price of refined products is set off a global price, not the price of landlocked.
But one of the reasons is because there's a bit of or there has been at the time of the filing of those papers, a bit of a glut in the Midwest markets, in part because there wasn't this terminal all the way down to Port Arthur. But, okay. Admiral Blair, do you think that there's, with respect to the title of this hearing is Geopolitical Potential, do we have a geopolitical potential in light of the Russian invasion and occupation and annexation of Crimea? Do we have a potential in Western Europe and former Eastern Europe, satellite countries, and former republics of the Soviet Union, to actually provide product, especially natural gas, as a substitute for Russia? And do you think that's a realistic thing to promise anytime soon, given logistics and infrastructure and so forth?
You know, Representative Connolly, what I've learned about the natural gas business is a sort of a three-dimensional chess game, and in fact, we've already improved the energy security of Europe by our domestic natural gas. In that same Port Arthur area, there were a bunch of liquid natural gas facilities built for importing natural gas from Qatar, because when those were started building 7, 8 years ago, we thought we would need it. Those plants are completely idle now. That gas went to Rotterdam, liquefied there, brought the price down from the artificially oil-based price that Gazprom had been charging, and that has in fact improved the lives of Western European consumers. It's not quite a global, it's not a global market like oil, but it does have these global interactions. I think I think diversity of liquid natural gas supply is important for Western and Eastern European security from Russia. I think, though, that it's not the only factor, that the interconnection of pipelines and LNG terminals is necessary in order for Europeans to be able to switch from Russian gas to LNG, and this is something that they have to do, and I think they would pay a premium for it. It would be duplicative. As you remember, since we both sat in oil lines together, there was...
No, you're mixing me up with Ted Yoho.
But as you remember, this Russian gas to Europe controversy has been going on since the early 1980s, and Europe has this approach avoidance with Russia. I think Crimean incidents have demonstrated the avoidance side pretty conclusively, and the Europeans need to build themselves a more flexible natural gas structure, which then Qatar, Australian, American liquefied natural gas could feed, so that they wouldn't get the lights switched off, so that they wouldn't get the price jacked up. And I think that ought to be a joint venture that we work on together.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, but I commend that last thought to you as you contemplate a potential trip to the region. I think that's really a very important point. In the long run, Europe itself has to look at infrastructure that will allow for alternative supplies.
To reach that market, and you're right, Mr. Connolly. I think this is one of the things that Lithuania or the Baltic states are looking at in terms of this floating platform, which is underway in terms of the building of this. And I better turn to Mr. Tom Marino. He's been very patient, of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman, and I apologize. I've been juggling the schedule like everyone has this morning. I'm going to get right to the point. As a prosecutor, I'm going to ask direct questions. I would like direct answers. Dr. Levy, what is in fracking that has not been transparent to the public, particularly in the state of Pennsylvania, where I come from?
I can't give you a state-by-state take, but in general, the public does not always know what is in the fluids being used in a particular frac job.
Okay, but in Pennsylvania, and correct me if I'm wrong, that has to be listed, and they have access to that information.
They have access to that information. I'm not sure exactly when, but you know the Pennsylvania rules better than I do.
Right, and my good friend from California, Pennsylvania, the EPA has stated that Pennsylvania is one of the best states in the union when it comes to protecting the interest of people as far as their health and fracking and the process by which it is being monitored. So we just offer the country an opportunity to come to Pennsylvania and see how we do it if that's the way we have to do it. I don't want to see the federal government at. Federal government, we've seen what the federal government has done over the past 40 years. It's put us $18 trillion into debt. So the less federal government in my life, the better. But we do need to make sure that standards are followed like they are in Pennsylvania. So, you know, I hear from people that do not like fracking, do not like gas. They'll say to me, there's a program that shows where you turn the spigot on and you put a match to it and poof. Well, you know, 45 years ago when I was at my uncle's cabin in Cascade, Pennsylvania, that was kind of neat when he turned the spigot on and snapped the lighter on and poof, there it was. That's methane. Okay, that happens. Nothing new. As far as energy independence, is there such a thing, and can we achieve it? And anyone who wants to address this, please.
I would say, Mr. Marino, that back to these oil embargoes that we talked about, back in the 60s and 70s, Norway and the UK were were, in theory, energy independent. They produced more than they consumed, and they sent it over. When the prices went up because of the OPEC embargo, Norwegians and Brits paid 4 times as much for gas as they had the year before. So
I guess we need to put a meaning on energy independent, don't we?
security is the right word. Security is the right word.
I like that.
And I think that's what we're really looking for. And security means that we don't get jacked around by other countries or groups of countries in pursuing our own interests, and we can jack around countries that are misbehaving for their purposes.
Great point. As I said, I live in the middle of it. I'm out in the country. I like seeing the bear and the deer graze on my property. I get my water from a well out of the ground. I have children. And how dare someone who opposes gas drilling say that I would jeopardize my children's health? I know this process. I've been in more rigs. I've done more readings. I've been reviewed more studies. I've talked to more scientists. And in fact, in one of the areas in my district in Pennsylvania, there was a big deal about it's polluting the water. Well, finally, the EPA came and said there is no scientific evidence whatsoever that fracking is polluting the water. And if it does, and destroy and attempts to cause harm in the environment, I'm going to be the first guy there in line saying, it's got to stop, and we have to fix this. Let's talk about the price for a moment. I'm concerned about the price of gas, natural gas, going overseas for this reason and this reason alone. I don't want to see the American people, I don't want to see the people in Pennsylvania have to pay a higher price for their gas that is their gas because they can sell it for a better price overseas. I don't have a problem with it being sold overseas at whatever price they can get. But I think the people in Pennsylvania and the people in this country deserve a fair price on the natural gas. Care to talk about that?
If you don't mind, I'd like to address that.
Please.
I can assure you that with the Marcellus production being so tremendous, the people of Pennsylvania will never have to pay more for their natural gas due to LNG export.
That's just what I want to hear.
I had one more comment. You know, the Bakken on-ramp on Keystone that's projected for the Keystone XL pipeline would add 300,000 barrels, none of which is contracted for exports.
Good segue, because I want to finish with saying, let's talk a moment, not about if it's going to decrease the price of oil or the consumption. Let's talk about this administration who talks a good job about creating jobs, but could create 20,000 jobs instantly if the president signed to have the Keystone XL pipeline go into effect, and then an additional several 100,000 jobs over the next few years. And let's talk about, there was an issue about refining. Yes, I know a little bit about oil refinery too. There are different plants that refine for different reasons and come up with different byproducts that could be sold in this country cheaper. So if for nothing else, how about creating jobs? And I see that my time has expired and I must yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Over here.
Mr. Connolly.
Mr. Chairman, the Washington Post did an extensive analysis of job creation related to the Keystone Pipeline, and it found no such figures as suggested by my friend from Pennsylvania. So I would ask, with unanimous consent, that the Washington Post analysis be entered into the record. And
if my friend would yield for a moment.
I have to, I'm going to,
okay,
this is a special request from the chairman.
Well, let me yield first to the gentleman.
And I can come up with 10 articles that show the jobs that will be created on this. Now, there's a back and forth on this, and we know there's a back and forth on this, but there's no downside to this. There's no downside whatsoever to
Mr. Chairman.
Executing this XL pipeline.
Okay,
Chairman,
I'm going to return. I'm going to yield time to the gentleman. I'm going to recognize the gentleman from Virginia.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just say to my friend from Pennsylvania, that's not the point. The point is he cited some figures about job creation that are directly disputed by the Washington Post analysis, which was fairly thorough. He's more than welcome to enter something into the record that would dispute it, but I'd like the Washington Post analysis in the record because it's considerable variance from the assertions made by my friend from Pennsylvania.
Well, let me opine on this for one moment, if the gentleman will. Let me respond to the gentleman of Virginia that both of you will be allowed to submit for the record your facts and figures, whether they be from an article in the Washington Post or whether they be from some studies that have been put together by those who have support the pipeline.
I thank the chair.
And I would also just like to thank our witnesses for the efforts they put into their statements. There is considerable information within those statements themselves. Ms. Rosenberg and gentlemen, it's impressive what you've put together laying out your arguments. I think we've had a dynamic discussion here because of our witnesses about the geopolitics of energy. I do think it's logical. I mean, I see the point that one of the things that keeps Russia afloat as a nation is the exports of their gas and oil. 70% of their trade is exports. So clearly, in their calculus, exporting of oil is key to their influence. They're wielding a tremendous amount of influence as a consequence of it. And clearly, we do have a situation here where, for a number of reasons, the administration is blocking exports. I mean, the pipeline would be one example, but another example would be the LNG and the question of whether we're going to use that strategically with respect to the situation in Eastern Europe. Now, I guess for me, one of the vexing things about this is that when you have a glut in your market of gas, you end up seeing that gas flared. And if there's an environmental consequence, it's flaring of gas. Certainly in Africa, we worked to address that issue of the flaring of gas across Africa, back when I used to chair that subcommittee, and that's been addressed. So we do have a glut. We do have flaring of gas here in the United States. It would seem to me logically if we could export that gas in order to help break the monopoly pricing situation, that would be good. Energy innovations, you know, this is the hard thing to keep up with, the constant change in this industry of energy innovations. They're making the United States more competitive. We're seeing that. We're also seeing companies from around the world moving to the United States because we have lower cost manufacturing here. And Mr. Connolly, this is just one point I would make. If we see the Keystone Pipeline, a pipeline built not here to where we basically have a hand in the outcome and where it's proximate to our markets, but instead to Vancouver where it is shipped to our economic competitors overseas in Asia. Right now, our principal competitor there has an energy price that's 30% higher than ours. It's one of the reasons why our manufacturing is still competitive despite the labor differential. So it does seem logical to me that we would want to make certain at the end of the day that that energy is refined in refineries which are cleaner burning here, cleaner burning than the ones that are in Asia, and in which that product, instead of being unleashed in a market with a higher energy price, is proximate to, you know, the southeast United States and to manufacturing facilities there, because we're going to continue to be in that economic conundrum where we're competing with Asia, principally a country in Asia which right now is disadvantaged. I don't want to see us mishandle a situation and have our economic competitor end up with a lower cost of energy than we have here in the United States as a consequence of us treating Canada in a way that, frankly, our ally is taking very personally at the moment. And so let's create the jobs here. We need to build on our domestic strength. We need to use them also as an asset for national security. And again, I thank the witnesses and I thank the members of this panel. We're adjourned.